She built walls so perfect, she forgot they were walls. He never knocked. He simply stood close enough that she remembered some doors only open from the inside. We are about to hear this story right now. The memo arrived at 8:30, before Hermione had finished her first cup of tea. It folded itself into the shape of a crane, Ministry Standard, Ministry Grey, and landed on the precise centre of her desk with the quiet authority of something that had already decided her morning for her. She set down her cup, picked up the memo, unfolded it with the particular care she gave all paper, smoothing each crease flat before she read a single word, as though the information inside might behave better if the vessel containing it was properly maintained. Interdepartmental Committee on Post-War Magical Reparations. First convening. Thursday, 9 o'clock. Attendance mandatory. Members appointed by the office of the minister. Her name was third on the list. His was sixth. She read it twice. Then she set the parchment down, picked up her tea, found it had gone cold, and drank it anyway. The Department of Magical Law Enforcement smelled perpetually of old parchment and iron. Not the romantic iron of a blacksmith's forge, something thinner, more administrative. The iron of filing cabinets left too long in damp corridors, of regulations printed and reprinted until the ink had soaked into the walls themselves. Hermione had grown over 2 years to find it comforting. She arrived each morning at 7:45, never earlier, which would have seemed compulsive, never later, which would have been careless. And she hung her coat on the third hook from the left, which was hers by unspoken agreement with the 3 colleagues who arrived after her. She made tea. She reviewed the overnight correspondence. She drafted, amended, cross-referenced, and filed. She attended every meeting for which she was required, and none for which she was not. She was, in the estimation of everyone who worked alongside her, extraordinarily competent. She was, in the privacy of her own ribcage, where no one had clearance to look, extraordinarily tired. Not the tiredness of overwork. She understood that variety well enough. It had a texture, a weight, a particular ache behind the eyes that responded to sleep and occasionally to a second biscuit. This was something else, something closer to the sensation of holding a door shut against a wind you couldn't name. Every muscle doing exactly what it was supposed to do, no failure anywhere in the system, and yet the sustained effort of it, the relentless maintenance of it, had begun to hollow her out in places she couldn't point to on a diagram. She didn't mention this to anyone. There was no productive outcome that could result from mentioning it. She straightened a stack of already straight parchment on her desk, checked the time, and went to find the committee room. He was already there. Not first. There were 2 others ahead of him, a woman from creature regulation she recognized by face, and a man from international cooperation she didn't recognize at all. But he had positioned himself with the particular geometry of someone who had calculated exactly how much of the room he could claim without appearing to try. Third chair from the head of the table, left side, angled very slightly toward the door. Draco Malfoy looked, at 20 years old, like a version of himself that had been taken apart and reassembled by someone working from memory rather than instruction. The architecture was the same. The pale precision of his features, the particular set of his jaw, the way he occupied space as though he'd been given it rather than earned it. But something in the arrangement had shifted. The arrogance that used to arrive in the room before he did had been replaced by something quieter and considerably more difficult to read. He was watching the door when she walked through it. She didn't allow herself to pause. She crossed to the opposite side of the table, right side, second chair from the head, set her folio down with a decisive click, uncapped her quill, and directed her attention to the blank parchment in front of her, as though it contained something worth reading. In her peripheral vision, he hadn't looked away. Stop it, she thought. Not at him, precisely. At the part of herself that had clocked him the moment she entered, catalogued him in that first half-second with an attention she hadn't chosen and couldn't fully explain. She had thought, in the 2 years since the war, that she had become reasonably good at managing her reactions to Draco Malfoy. Reasonably good at the particular internal discipline required to encounter someone who existed in your memory as 3 distinct and contradictory people. The schoolyard antagonist, the frightened boy in the room of requirement, the figure who had stood in the manor and failed to confirm her identity to his aunt, and to treat the person standing in front of you as simply a person. She had been, apparently, less good at it than she thought. Granger. His voice was different too, lower than she remembered, or perhaps simply less performed. At school, his voice had always carried an audience. Even in one-on-one conversation, he had spoken to some imagined gallery, some perpetual tribunal of witnesses. Now it landed between them with the flatness of something that expected no particular response. She looked up from her parchment. Malfoy. He held her gaze for precisely 2 seconds. She counted, reflexively, helplessly, and then dropped his attention to the folio in front of him. It was unmarked, she noticed. No notes prepared. No pre-meeting preparation visible. She had 4 pages of background reading annotated in 3 colors. Something about this irritated her in a way she chose not to examine. The committee was chaired by a senior undersecretary named Pavel, a compact man with the brisk energy of someone who had spent 30 years winning arguments he hadn't started. He outlined the committee's mandate with the efficient joylessness of someone reading aloud from a document he had written himself and found largely adequate. The mandate: review outstanding reparation claims from parties affected by Death Eater activity during the war. Assess eligibility. Propose compensation frameworks. Report to the minister by the 1st of the following quarter. Hermione had strong opinions about reparations frameworks. She had, in fact, submitted a 12-page policy proposal on the subject 8 months ago, which had been received warmly and actioned slowly in the way that most things at the ministry were received and actioned. She had views on means-testing criteria, on the distinction between material and psychological harm, on the inadequacy of the current definition of affected party, which excluded several categories of Muggle-born families who had experienced indirect but substantive loss. She was prepared to articulate these views. She was, in fact, looking forward to it. She had gotten through approximately 4 minutes of a measured, well-structured contribution to the preliminary discussion, when Draco Malfoy said, without inflection, without looking up from the blank parchment, he had thus far contributed nothing to. That definition won't survive the legal review. The room went very still in the particular way rooms do when someone says something that is either very wrong or very accurate, and no one is yet certain which. Hermione completed her sentence. Then she said with equal flatness, "I beg your pardon." He looked up then, not at the room, at her. The expanded definition of affected party. It can't include indirect loss to Muggle families without triggering the statute provisions on cross-community liability. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes spent 3 years building a firewall around exactly that category after the First War. If you open that door here, you're not just reforming reparations, you're reopening a jurisdictional dispute that will stall the entire framework for 2 years minimum. The silence held for another beat. Then the man from International Cooperation said, carefully, "That's actually a reasonable point." Hermione's quill was very still in her hand. She was aware of the specific quality of her own composure in this moment, the way she was holding it, not wearing it. The distinction mattered. Wearing it would have meant it was natural. Holding it meant the effort was visible, at least to herself. "I'm aware of the statute provisions," she said. "I propose a parallel track. The reparations framework proceeds under the existing definition, while a separate working group addresses the jurisdictional question. It's not a single door, it's 2 doors. Malfoy considered this. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Not concession, something slower than that. The look of a person updating a calculation. "That could work," he said, and returned to his blank parchment. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Hermione made 7 substantive contributions. Malfoy made 3. Each of his was precise, legally specific, and arrived without warning or preamble, like a stone dropped into still water. The disruption disproportionate to the apparent effort. She found this, on some level she preferred not to examine, deeply annoying. She found it, on another level she refused to examine at all, deeply compelling. Outside, in the corridor afterward, the committee members dispersing in the direction of their respective departments, she became aware of him falling into step beside her. Not with her. Beside her, at a distance that maintained perfect ambiguity about whether it was intentional. She kept walking. 2 doors, he said. Yes. It's not a bad instinct. A pause, brief but weighted. It's also not how the ministry works. She stopped walking. He stopped too, half a step later, and turned to face her with the unhurried ease of someone who had anticipated this exact moment. The corridor was empty, except for a portrait of a sleeping former minister, who had, even in oil and canvas, the expression of someone who had long since stopped caring about whatever argument was happening beneath him. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means you designed the better solution," he said, "and you'll spend the next 6 months watching it be implemented in a worse one. That's how the ministry works. You know that." "Then perhaps," she said, "the better solution is to fight for the better one." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile. Too minimal, too controlled for that. More the idea of amusement, held at a careful distance. "You believe that?" he said. Not a question. Yes. Her quill case was in her left hand. She was gripping it more firmly than necessary. "Don't you?" He looked at her for a long moment. The corridor hummed faintly with the distant machinery of the ministry. Enchanted memos rerouting overhead, lifts arriving and departing with their characteristic shudder. The whole vast bureaucratic apparatus turning over like a sleeping creature. "I believe," he said, "that you've decided what you believe, and you're very good at not letting anything disturb it." He said it without cruelty. That was the thing. There was no blade in it, no schoolyard pleasure. It landed like a diagnosis, clinical, dispassionate, delivered by someone who had no particular investment in whether you accepted the findings or not. She held his gaze. "I'll see you Thursday," she said. She turned and walked away. She did not straighten her sleeve cuffs until she was around the corner and entirely out of sight. That night, in her flat in Islington, a flat that was precisely the right size, precisely the right distance from the ministry, furnished with the particular intentionality of someone who had thought carefully about every object she allowed to share her space. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she had made and then forgotten, and stared at the blank space above her bookshelf. "You've decided what you believe, and you're very good at not letting anything disturb it." She picked up the tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway, the same way she had that morning, the same reflexive refusal to waste something just because it had become uncomfortable. Outside, London was doing what London did in early November. A thin, persistent rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be weather or just atmosphere, running in rivulets down the window pane and refracting the streetlight into something almost beautiful if you looked at it the right way. She wasn't looking at the window. She was thinking about the way he had said, "You believe that," the specific quality of his attention in that moment, as though he were reading something written in very small print that most people didn't know was there. She was thinking about the fact that it had bothered her. She was thinking, with the careful, systematic thoroughness she applied to all problems she didn't want to look at directly, about whether the reason it bothered her was that he was wrong. The rain made its quiet argument against the glass. She didn't sleep well, but she had, by morning, filed that fact away in the category of temporary disruptions, origin, external, and she arrived at work at 7:45, hung her coat on the third hook, and made her tea. It did not, this morning, go cold before she could drink it. That was something. Outside her window, 2 floors down, a memo in the shape of a crane flapped past through the grey November air, heading, with the blind confidence of all ministry correspondence, precisely where it had been told to go. Thursday arrived the way difficult things often do, quietly, without announcement, slipping in behind the ordinary machinery of a workday morning as though it had always been there. Hermione was prepared. She had spent Wednesday evening reviewing the statute provisions Malfoy had cited, locating the original 1947 legislation, reading the 3 subsequent amendments, and drafting a counter-framework that addressed the jurisdictional question without requiring a separate working group at all. It was, she felt, genuinely elegant. A single structure that accomplished what 2 had been needed to accomplish before, the legal architecture load-bearing in exactly the right places. She had also, at some point between the Second Amendment and the Third, made a fresh pot of tea, eaten half a piece of toast without noticing, and realized she had been at her kitchen table for 4 hours. this was normal. This was simply how she worked. She told herself this with the same quiet insistence she applied to all the things that needed regular reassurance. And she went to bed at 11:15, and she lay in the dark listening to the rain, still falling as though it had never stopped. And she thought about nothing in particular until her mind finally, grudgingly, released her into sleep. He was there when she arrived. Again, same chair, same angle toward the door. This time with a cup of coffee, black, no concessions, and a copy of the morning's Daily Prophet folded to an inside page, which he was reading with the focused disinterest of someone doing something with their hands while their mind was elsewhere entirely. He didn't look up when she entered. She didn't look at him. She took her chair, right side, second from the head, already becoming hers in some unspoken territorial way that she found simultaneously reassuring and faintly ridiculous, opened her folio, uncapped her quill, and arranged her notes in the order she intended to present them. The 2 pages on the jurisdictional solution went on top. Pavel opened the meeting with the particular energy of a man who had arrived with an agenda and intended to honor it regardless of what the room thought. They moved through the first 3 items in reasonable time. Hermione contributed twice, cleanly, with the measured precision of someone who had decided exactly how much rope each point required and given it precisely that. On the 4th item, the definition of affected party and the jurisdictional question, she presented her revised framework. She spoke for 6 minutes. She had timed it at home, which she would not have mentioned to anyone. When she finished, the room held the particular quality of attention that indicated genuine engagement rather than polite endurance. The woman from Creature Regulation was nodding slowly. The man from International Cooperation had picked up his quill. Pavel said, "This addresses the cross-community liability concern directly. Malfoy, you raised the original objection. Your assessment?" There was a pause, not a long pause, perhaps 3 seconds. But in 3 seconds, in a quiet room, certain things become audible. The scratch of quill on parchment elsewhere in the building, the faint percussion of rain on the high windows, the specific quality of one person's attention turning toward another, like a lens finding focus. "It's sound," Malfoy said. Hermione kept her eyes on her notes. "The single framework approach is cleaner than the parallel track," he continued. "Less surface area for political interference. The 1947 provisions are navigable if you structure the eligibility criteria the way she's described." He paused again. "It'll work." She looked up then, because not looking up would have been its own kind of statement. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Pavel, his expression the professional neutral of someone delivering a verdict on a case in which they have no personal stake. But his coffee cup, she noticed, was very precisely positioned, equidistant from both edges of the table, a geometry too exact to be accidental. And his right hand was resting beside it with a stillness that had the character of something consciously maintained. After the meeting, he was beside her again in the corridor. Again, that half-step ambiguity, that exact distance, not companionable, not aggressive, occupying the grammatical space between the two with practiced ease. This time, she didn't wait. "Thank you," she said, "for the support in there." "I didn't support you," he said. "I assessed the framework and found it legally adequate." That's a very particular way of saying the same thing. It's a more accurate way. She glanced at him. He was looking ahead, navigating the corridor with the peripheral awareness of someone who had spent years in environments where situational awareness was not optional. "Why does the distinction matter to you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The corridor turned, and they turned with it, and somewhere above them a cluster of enchanted memos wheeled and regrouped like starlings. "Because support implies I've chosen a side," he said. "I haven't. I've chosen a position. There's a difference. And if the position had been mine, then I'd have said so." She considered this. There was something in it she wanted to argue with and couldn't quite locate. The seam of it, the place where she could get purchase. It was the kind of logic that was internally consistent in a way that made it very difficult to challenge without challenging the entire framework it rested on. "You're very careful," she said finally, "about not being seen to be on anyone's side." He stopped walking. She stopped too, a beat later, and turned to find him looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite the diagnostic detachment of their first encounter, something with more friction in it, as though her observation had made contact with something he hadn't expected to be contactable. "Yes," he said, "just that." One word, carrying more weight than its syllables suggested. "Is that a habit?" she asked, "or a strategy?" The question surprised her as much as it appeared to surprise him. She hadn't planned it, hadn't drafted it, hadn't run it through the internal filter that caught things before they arrived in the world half-formed and potentially damaging. It had simply come out, drawn by something in the quality of his stillness. Something moved behind his eyes, a kind of recalibration. "Both," he said. "Originally strategy, now habit. That's honest." "I find," he said, with the measured quiet of someone choosing words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, "that honesty is generally less expensive than the alternative, in the long run." She held his gaze for a moment. The corridor around them was doing its usual business. Figures passing at the peripheral distance, the ministry's perpetual low hum, the ozone faint smell of active enchantments somewhere nearby, sharp and fleeting as struck flint. "And what does it cost you?" she asked. "In the short run?" He looked at her for a long moment, the kind of look that doesn't land on the surface of a person, but pushes slightly past it, finding the places where the presentation meets the thing underneath. "Conversations like this one," he said. She thought about it for the rest of the day. Not continuously. She had work, she had correspondence, she had a meeting at 3 about the reclassification of several dark objects currently in ministry custody, which required her full attention and received it, but in the margins. In the 30 seconds between finishing one document and beginning the next. In the particular white space of the lift ride between floors. Originally, strategy, now habit. She understood that. She understood it in a way she found privately uncomfortable, because understanding Draco Malfoy's relationship to self-protective behavior required a level of self-recognition she hadn't budgeted for on a Thursday. She had built things too, after the war. Everyone had. You didn't emerge from a year of running and hiding and watching people die without building something afterward, some structure to put between yourself and the fact of what you'd experienced. The question was what you built and whether you remembered, after enough time had passed, that you'd built it. Whether the construction had become so familiar that you'd started calling it your personality. She thought about this with the detached analytical quality she brought to all uncomfortable questions, holding it at arm's length, turning it over, examining its facets without allowing it to get close enough to do what it was actually capable of doing. Then she closed the document she'd been pretending to read, picked up her quill, and went back to work. The archive request came the following week. A paper trail required for the reparations committee. Records from the final 18 months of Voldemort's regime, specifically documentation of Death Eater activity that had resulted in property seizure or destruction. The records existed. They were in sub-level Archive C, 7 floors below the main ministry building, in the section that still smelled faintly of dark magic, even after 2 years of cleansing charms. A scent like old smoke and something underneath it, metallic and dense, the olfactory residue of things that had happened in those rooms during the occupation. She had submitted the request through the proper channels. The archivist's response had been apologetic and unhelpful. The records were in the process of being recatalogued and couldn't be accessed without a second authorized signatory present, per the new protocols on sensitive wartime documentation. The second authorized signatory on the reparations committee was Draco Malfoy. She found this out at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, reading the archivist's memo with her tea going cold beside her for what felt like the 100th time this month. She sat for a moment. Then she picked up her quill and wrote him a note. Professional, brief, entirely adequate in every technical respect, explaining the situation and asking whether he was available to attend the archive on Wednesday morning. The response came back within the hour. 9 o'clock. Don't be late. M. She stared at the postscript, if 2 words could constitute a postscript, for slightly longer than was warranted. Then she filed the memo, gathered her coat, and left for the evening. On the steps of the ministry, the November air met her with its particular brand of cold. Not the dramatic cold of deep winter, but the grey, insistent cold of a season that hadn't quite committed yet. The kind of cold that found the gaps. Her scarf was wool, charcoal grey, wound twice. She tucked her chin into it and walked toward the apparition point. Don't be late. She had never, in her life, been late for anything. The audacity of the implied suggestion followed her all the way home, warming her inexplicably more than the wool did. Wednesday, 9 o'clock, sub-level Archive C. She was there at 8:53. He arrived at 9 exactly. She heard his footsteps in the corridor before she saw him, the particular rhythm of someone who moves as though the floor has already agreed to support him. He came through the archive door in his work robes, a dark charcoal that made the paleness of him look deliberate rather than accidental. And he stopped when he saw her and gave the faintest indication of something that might, in better light, have been amusement. "You're early," he said. "You said 9 o'clock. I said don't be late. There's a difference. The practical outcome is identical." He looked at her for a moment. Then, with the unhurried ease that she was beginning to recognize as a fixed feature of him, not laziness, not nonchalance, but the particular ease of someone who had decided long ago that urgency was a performance he no longer owed anyone. He moved past her into the archive proper. She followed. The room was vast and low-ceilinged, lit by wall-mounted lanterns that burned with a bluish magical light rather than warm flame, casting everything in the cool palette of something preserved rather than alive. Shelves rose in rows, floor to ceiling, packed with folders and ledgers and scrolled documents, each labelled in the cramped indexical hand of archivists who had prioritized accuracy over legibility. The smell hit her properly as they moved deeper in. Old parchment with its faint tooth, and underneath it that other thing, the mineral dark residue of spells cast in anger or desperation, soaked into the documents themselves. Draco paused at the third row. She watched him look at the shelves the way you look at something you have a complicated relationship with. Not afraid of it exactly, but not unaffected either. A quality of stillness that had a cost behind it. Section D, she said, consulting her notes. Subsection 14, Property Documentation, 1996 to 1998. He didn't move immediately. Right, he said. Just that. She found herself not filling the silence, which was, for her, unusual. She filled silences. It was practically reflexive, the verbal equivalent of straightening a crooked picture, an inability to leave a gap unfixed. But something about the quality of his stillness made filling it feel like an intrusion. She walked to Section D instead. Behind her, after a moment, she heard him follow. The records were worse than she had expected. Not in their volume. She had anticipated volume, had come prepared with a cataloguing system, colour-coded markers, a self-inking quill that could keep pace with her when the work required speed. She had prepared for the bureaucratic weight of it. What she hadn't prepared for was the texture. Names she recognized, addresses she could place on a map, dates that corresponded to things she remembered, not abstractly, not historically, but physically, in the way the body remembers events that happen to it directly. The seizure of the Bones family property. She remembered Susan Bones returning to Hogwarts in what should have been their 6th year, sitting at the Hufflepuff table with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that motion draws attention. The destruction of a Muggle-born family's home in Wiltshire. She remembered the name from a list she and Harry and Ron had compiled in the tent, cross-referencing disappearances, trying to keep track of who was still out there. She catalogued methodically. She did not allow herself to stop. 3 rows over, she could hear Malfoy working through his own section, the periodic slide of folders being removed from shelves, the soft percussion of documents being laid flat, the scratch of his quill making notations. Steady, unhurried, consistent. No hesitations she could detect. She told herself she wasn't listening for them. An hour in, she found the Malfoy estate documentation. It was a thick folder, cream parchment gone ivory at the edges, sealed with a ministry stamp dated November 1997. She almost set it aside. It was outside her section's scope, technically a matter for a different subsection. But the label stopped her. Malfoy, L. Property utilized for dark activity. Ref. Ministry Investigation File 4471-B. Utilized. Such a careful word. Such a particular exercise in bureaucratic distance from what it was actually describing. She set it in the relevant pile without opening it. Across the archive, Malfoy's quill had gone quiet. She looked up without meaning to. He was standing 3 rows over, visible through the gap between shelves, holding a document she couldn't see the face of. His posture was perfectly upright. Nothing collapsed in it, nothing that would read from a distance as anything other than professional focus. But his free hand, hanging at his side, had found the edge of the shelf beside him and was resting against it with a pressure that had whitened his knuckles to the color of old bone. She looked back at her own work. She did not mention what she'd seen. They worked through until noon without speaking beyond the necessary. Pass me that ledger, which subsection covers 1997 specifically. The cataloguing system in this section makes no logical sense. And there was a particular quality to the silence between those functional exchanges that was different from ordinary quiet. Denser. Something with mass to it, taking up space in the low-lit room the way smoke does, not obscuring, but altering the quality of everything seen through it. At 12:17, Hermione's quill ran dry. She reached into her bag for a replacement and found, to her private irritation, that she had somehow left her spare on her desk upstairs. She looked at the dry quill. She looked at the remaining third of her section, uncatalogued. She performed the rapid internal calculation of a person deciding between two options they don't love. "I need a quill," she said. Malfoy looked up from across the room. He reached into his inner pocket without comment and crossed to her row, extending a quill she recognized immediately. Black, long, slightly worn at the tip from heavy use. An expensive thing that had been used rather than displayed. She took it. Their fingers didn't touch. She was aware of the precise distance maintained, the careful geometry of the handover. "Thank you. Don't mention it." He turned to go back to his section. "Malfoy." He stopped, turned back with the unhurried patience of someone who had decided not to brace for things. She looked at him. She had not planned what she was about to say. It was forming as she opened her mouth, assembled from something she'd been not thinking about for the past 3 hours. The Bones property documentation, the Wiltshire file. There are 37 properties in my section, 37 families. She paused. "You knew some of them. Before." It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite an accusation either. It was something that lived in the space between the two, an observation extended in his direction, and the implicit question of what he would do with it. He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "And?" The word was quieter than she intended. It arrived in the space between them without the armor she'd meant to give it. Something moved through his expression, not the recalibration she'd seen before, something with more depth than that, something that moved the way water moves under ice, invisible except for what it does to the surface. "And nothing," he said quietly. "There is no and. There is only the file and the name on it, and the date and the thing that happened. There's no version of this where I have something useful to add to that." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking for something useful," she said. The lanterns breathed their blue light across the shelves. Somewhere in the archive's deeper sections, a cataloguing charm ticked over with a faint mechanical sound, sorting and resorting in its endless, patient loop. "What are you asking for?" he said. She didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer required admitting that she wasn't entirely sure, that the question had come from somewhere below the level at which she usually operated, from the place that had been working without her permission all morning, reading names and dates and addresses and feeling things she hadn't allocated space in her schedule to feel. "I don't know," she said finally. It cost her something to say that. She felt the cost of it, the small, precise pain of releasing a sentence without knowing where it would land. His expression shifted, not softening exactly. There was nothing yielding in him, nothing that gave easily. But some quality of his attention changed. The lens focused differently. "That's new," he said, not unkindly. "Don't," she said, and the word came out with more edge than she'd meant, clipping the air between them. He didn't flinch, didn't retreat into that professional neutrality. He simply waited, with the quality of stillness she was beginning to understand was not passivity, but its own kind of decision. The decision not to fill the space with anything that would let her off the hook. "I'm aware," she said more quietly, "that I don't always, that I sometimes—" She stopped. The sentence had 3 possible endings, and she didn't want any of them. She picked up his quill again, turned it once between her fingers, set it down. "I process things at a distance. I know I do. It's not that I don't feel them." "I know," he said. The simplicity of it surprised her. No qualification. No, "of course you do," with its condescending subtext. No attempt to do anything with the admission except receive it. "You know," she repeated. "You catalogued 37 files this morning," he said. "You didn't make a single error. Your handwriting didn't change." He paused. "And you've been gripping that quill for the past 2 minutes, hard enough to leave an indent in your fingers." She looked down at her right hand. He was correct. The quill had pressed a faint red crease into the side of her middle finger, curved and precise as a parenthesis. She set the quill down. "I'm fine," she said. "I know that too," he said. And there it was again, that diagnostic quality, but warmer than it had been in the corridor 3 weeks ago. Less clinical, more like recognition than assessment. They finished at 1:30. The completed catalogue covered 42 pages, divided between them with a rough equity that had evolved without discussion. Hermione stacked her section with the systematic neatness of someone who would have to live with the knowledge of its contents, not hiding that fact exactly, but giving it the dignity of order. Malfoy rolled his pages without stacking them, a looser method that somehow produced equally precise results. She watched him do it without commenting on the difference. They walked out of sub-level Archive C together, into the corridor with its warmer light and its absence of that particular smell. And Hermione felt the transition in her body, a slight release of something she hadn't known she was holding, like the first full breath after a long time of breathing carefully. In the lift, riding upward, they stood at the standard distance, not the ministry's standard, which was formal and spatial and involved avoiding eye contact with strangers, but their own developing standard, the specific distance of 2 people who had not agreed to be comfortable with each other, but had arrived there anyway through simple repeated proximity. "What you said," she started, stopped. He waited. "About honesty being less expensive in the long run." She kept her eyes on the lift doors. The numbers ticked upward. "Do you actually believe that? Or is it something you've decided to believe because the alternative is—" She searched for the right word, found 3 unsatisfactory ones, and landed on exhausting. The lift shuddered slightly between floors in the way that ministry lifts did, as though the mechanism had opinions about the conversations happening inside it. "Both things can be true," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I have." She turned to look at him then. He was already looking at her. Had been, she suspected, for most of the lift ride. In the warmer light of the upper floors, filtering down through the lift's brass cage, his face had a different quality than it did in the archive's blue lantern light. Less preserved, more present. "You do that," she said. "Do what?" "Answer questions with the exact amount of truth required and nothing in excess. Precisely calibrated honesty." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Is that a complaint?" "It's an observation." "Most of your complaints are," he said. "Observations, I mean. You dress them in the language of neutrality and then look very composed when they land." The lift stopped. Her floor. The doors opened with their characteristic exhale. She stepped out, turned back. He was looking at her through the parting doors with an expression she couldn't fully interpret. It had too many layers, too much compressed into too small a space, like a document folded too many times. "You do the same thing," she said, just with fewer words. The doors began to close. "I know," he said. The lift ascended without him. She stood in the corridor for a moment longer than she needed to, holding his quill, which she had apparently carried out of the archive without returning. It sat in her hand, black, slightly warm from use. She looked at it for a moment with the feeling of someone who has walked into a room for a reason they can no longer remember. Then she went back to her desk. She did not return the quill that afternoon. She told herself this was because she didn't have occasion to. She didn't pass his office. It wasn't worth a separate trip. She would return it at the next committee meeting, which was Thursday, which was 2 days away. She placed it in the left-hand drawer of her desk, underneath the color-coded markers and the self-inking spares. It was the most dishonest thing she had done in months. She found, sitting with that knowledge in the last hour of the working day, the thin winter light going amber through her office window and the ministry settling into its evening register around her. She found that it didn't feel the way she expected it to feel. It felt, quietly and without permission, like something kept. The quill stayed in her drawer for 6 days. She was aware of it the way you are aware of a loose thread on a favorite garment. Not constantly, not with any dramatic intensity, but with a low, persistent quality of attention that surfaced at odd moments. Opening the drawer for a marker, reaching past it for the self-inking spare. The brief, involuntary registration of its presence before her mind moved on to whatever it had actually come for. On the 7th day, she took it out and used it. Not for anything significant. A draft memo on the reclassification criteria she was preparing for the committee. The kind of document that didn't require her best quill. The kind she would normally have used a standard ministry issue nib for. She told herself she was testing the weight of it, the way different quills suited different kinds of writing. She told herself this with the fluency of someone who had been telling themselves convenient things for long enough that the habit had become frictionless. The quill wrote beautifully. It was balanced in a way that suggested it had been chosen with care, the nib cut at a precise angle that rewarded a light hand. Her own handwriting, produced by it, looked slightly different, a fraction more fluid, the letters a touch less governed. She stared at a paragraph she had written and recognized, with a discomfort she chose not to name, that she preferred it. Thursday. The committee room. She arrived at 8:58. He was already there. She had stopped being surprised by this. What she had not stopped being was aware of it, the way the room organized itself differently around his presence, the particular quality of a space that contains Draco Malfoy as opposed to a space that doesn't. Not dramatic, subtle in the way that pressure changes are subtle, undetectable until you notice that your ears have adjusted. She took her chair, set out her notes, placed his quill on the table in front of her, deliberately on his side of the invisible boundary their working arrangement had established. He looked at it, then at her. She had prepared something to say, a brief, professionally adequate sentence about having accidentally carried it from the archive and meaning to return it sooner. She had the sentence ready. It was a good sentence. It explained everything and implied nothing. She didn't say it. "Thank you for the loan," she said instead. He picked up the quill, turned it once between his fingers, the same gesture she had made in the archive, she realized, with a lurch of recognition, and set it in his own breast pocket. "Was it useful?" he asked. "Yes." "Good." Pavel opened the meeting. They were 40 minutes in when it happened. The item on the table was eligibility criteria for psychological harm claims, one of the more contested areas of the framework, where the legal definition of harm rubbed against the ministry's institutional reluctance to quantify anything that couldn't be documented in a St. Mungo's report. Hermione had views. She had, more specifically, a carefully constructed argument for expanding the criteria to include a broader category of trauma that she had been building toward in the discussion with the steady patience of someone laying groundwork. She had nearly reached the point of presenting it when Aldrich Fownes, the man from the Department of Mysteries who had been contributing very little thus far and had apparently been storing the energy thus conserved for a single comprehensive act of obstruction, said, with the tone of someone producing an observation they consider unanswerable, "With respect, the ministry cannot practically be expected to adjudicate the internal experiences of claimants. Psychological suffering is not an objective category." Hermione's quill stilled on the parchment. She breathed in. She breathed out. She began to construct, with her usual precision, the measured and thoroughly evidenced response that this required. She got 2 sentences in before something shifted, not externally. Inside, in the place she kept things that weren't for professional use. Something that had been building quietly for 40 minutes, for 6 weeks, for 2 years of reading files and drafting frameworks and processing 37 families at arm's length, moved toward the surface with a momentum that her usual mechanisms couldn't fully intercept. Psychological suffering, she heard herself say, is not an objective category in the same way that a house fire is not an objective category. We can measure the house. We cannot measure the experience of watching it burn. That does not mean the experience is not real, and it does not mean the ministry is absolved of its responsibility to the people who had to stand there. The room was very quiet. Her voice had not been raised. She had not quite lost the professional register, but something in the quality of it had changed. Something had come through that she hadn't cleared for the meeting, hadn't reviewed and approved, and sent through the proper channels of her own internal governance. Something direct. Founds blinked. The woman from creature regulations set down her quill with the careful deliberateness of someone removing themselves from a line of fire. Pavel looked at his agenda as though it might offer guidance. Draco Malfoy across the table was looking at her with an expression she had never seen from him before. Not the diagnostic assessment, not the precisely calibrated neutrality. Something with more current in it, something alert and unguarded in a way that lasted only a moment before the familiar composure resettled over it. But she had seen it. She was certain she had seen it. "The Granger framework," he said, into the silence, with the measured authority of someone closing a door on a drafty room, "already addresses the evidentiary question. Psychological harm claims would require corroborating documentation, healers' records, witness accounts, or ministerially approved assessment. It's not open-ended. Founds, your concern is about administrative workability, which is legitimate, but it's already been accounted for." Founds looked at his notes. "I see." "Good," Malfoy said. "Then we can move on." They moved on. Afterward, in the corridor, she didn't wait for him to fall into step. She stopped at the turn and let him catch up, which he did without appearing to adjust his pace. They walked together for a moment in silence. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." "The argument would have landed." "Probably." He considered. In about 4 more minutes, after he'd made 2 additional points you'd already anticipated, and you dismantled both of them. "Yes." She glanced at him. "Then why?" He was quiet for a beat. One of his considered pauses. Not hesitation, she'd come to understand, but the habit of a person who had learned that the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between a door opening and a door remaining shut. "Because you'd already done the work," he said, "and because Founds is the kind of man who responds to authority of a particular kind, and you were..." Another pause. "You were saying something true. I didn't want it to be buried under his need to feel that he'd put up adequate resistance." She processed this. It was, she recognized, a form of consideration so specific, so precisely targeted to their actual situation rather than its surface, that it required genuine attention to the person it was directed at, not the performance of attention, the real thing. "Thank you," she said, for the second time that morning. "You keep thanking me," he said, "for things I do, because I think they're right, not for you specifically." "I know," she said. "I do it anyway." Something shifted in his expression, that almost smile, closer today than it usually came. "Why?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Because it matters to me that someone, that you..." She stopped, redirected. "Because I notice, that's all." They had reached the junction where their departments diverged. She would go right, he would go left. This geography had repeated itself after every meeting, every archive session, every corridor conversation. The same parting, the same direction, the same exchange of something that functioned as a goodbye without quite being one. Today, he stopped at the junction and turned to face her properly. "What you said in there," he said, "about standing watching the house burn." She waited. "That wasn't from the framework," he said. "No." "Where was it from?" The question was quiet, quieter than his questions usually were, stripped of the clinical distance, the precise calibration. It arrived without any mechanism of self-protection, and she felt the absence of that protection the way you feel a change in air pressure, as a physical fact, unargued. "I don't know," she said. And then, because she did know, and because he had said that honesty was less expensive in the long run, "Yes, I do." It was from the archive, the files, from... She stopped. From not allowing myself to have feelings about them in a professional context and having them surface anyway. He looked at her for a long moment. "That's going to keep happening," he said. "The longer you try to file it away." "I know." "And?" She registered the word, her own word, returned to her from the archive 3 weeks ago. The question she had asked him without knowing what she wanted from it. "And I don't know what to do about that," she said. "Yes, you do," he said. "You just don't like the answer." The junction stretched between them. From the right, the sounds of her department, quills and memos, and the bureaucratic breath of her ordinary day. From the left, the quieter sounds of his. "What would you do?" she asked. "Feel it," he said simply. "In whatever situation it arrives, without filing a formal impact assessment first." "That's easy for you to say." "It wasn't," he said. "Wasn't easy at all." Something in the past tense of it, the way he held the was, the implication of everything it had cost him to get to where he'd gotten, opened a space in her chest she hadn't known was sealed. She looked at him. He stood at the junction with the late November light coming pale and flat through the high ministry windows behind him, and he looked, not comfortable, not at ease, but settled, like something that had been through weather and stayed standing, not intact, standing. She wondered with a clarity that surprised her what it had taken. What particular sequence of events and losses and deliberate choices had produced that quality of settledness in a person who had, at 17, been one of the most visibly fractured people she had ever seen. She didn't ask, but she thought she might someday. She thought she might actually want to know. "I'll see you Tuesday," she said. "Tuesday," he agreed. She turned right. 3 steps down the corridor, she became aware that she was walking differently. Not dramatically, not in any way anyone passing her would notice. But something in her posture had released a half-degree, some held angle in her shoulders that had been held so long she'd stopped registering it as tension. She didn't straighten it back. She let it stay released and walked the rest of the corridor in the body she actually had, rather than the one she usually performed. It was, she thought, an extremely small act of something. She thought about what Draco Malfoy would call it. She thought he would probably call it a start, and she thought he would be right. And she thought that being right in that particular way, quietly, without requiring her to acknowledge it, was one of the more unsettling things about him. She turned the corner into her department. At her desk, in the left-hand drawer, there was now only her own things, markers and spares and drafted pages. The quill was gone, returned, back in his breast pocket where it belonged. The drawer felt different without it. She noticed this and did not file it away. The ministry at night was a different country. Hermione had stayed late before, often, regularly, with the methodical frequency of someone who genuinely couldn't locate the boundary between working hard and working instead of something else. She knew the particular quality of the building after 6 o'clock, when the memos stopped their aerial circuits and settled into their overnight trays, when the lifts slowed to their minimal after-hours schedule, when the corridors lost their daytime density and became something longer, more resonant, each footstep finding an echo it couldn't locate during business hours. She had never, before tonight, stayed late in sub-level Archive C. The reparations deadline had moved, a ministerial decision handed down that afternoon with the cheerful arbitrariness of authority exercising itself. From the first of the quarter to 3 weeks earlier, which meant the catalogue wasn't a thorough task anymore. It was an urgent one, which meant the remaining 2 sections needed to be completed this week, which meant tonight. She had owled Malfoy at 4:30. His response had come back in 11 minutes. "I'll be there at 7. Bring something to eat." The archive makes people forget to. She had stared at that last sentence for a moment. The particular quality of its attention, the way it assumed knowledge of her habits with the ease of someone who had been paying close attention for long enough that the knowledge had simply accumulated. And then she had gone to the small canteen on level 2 and bought 2 portions of whatever was left at that hour, which turned out to be lentil soup and bread that was approximately half a day past its best, and she had carried it down to sub-level Archive C in a paper bag that grew translucent with warmth at the bottom. She arrived at 6:43. She did not examine what this said about her. He arrived at 7 exactly, in a different set of robes than he'd worn during the day. Darker, less formal, the kind you change into when you've gone home briefly and returned, which meant he had gone home briefly and returned, which was a piece of information she didn't know what to do with, and so set aside. He looked at the paper bag on the archive table. "Lentil soup," she said. It was that, or whatever they were calling the pastry. "Good choice," he said, and settled into the chair across from her with the unhurried ease of someone who had decided at some earlier point in the evening that whatever tonight was going to be, he was going to be present for it without his usual armor of productive detachment. She wasn't sure she'd registered that decision at the time. She registered it now. They worked. The archive had a different character at night. The bluish lantern light that had seemed cold and preserving during the day took on a different quality in the absence of any competing warmth. Something closer to the light in old photographs, flattening and truthful at once. The sound of the building changed. During the day, sub-level Archive C sat underneath the Ministry's ambient noise like a stone beneath moving water. You could feel the life happening above. At night, the stone was simply itself, silent and its own. Their working sounds filled it differently. Her quill on parchment, the soft resistance of old folders being opened, examined, replaced. His quieter method, less notating, more reading, longer pauses between movements that she had initially interpreted as slowness and had revised to something more like consideration. He read everything, not for the catalogue, for the content. She had started doing the same, somewhere in the 3rd week without consciously deciding to. At 8:15, she opened the soup. The archive's enchantments kept it at the same temperature it had been at 6:43, which was only slightly warmer than ideal. But she ate it anyway because the bread needed something, and because she was, now that she'd stopped working for 30 seconds, actually hungry. She pushed his portion across the table without comment. He ate without commenting either. This was, she had come to understand, his version of gratitude. The acceptance of a thing without making a performance of the acceptance. The refusal to burden a simple kindness with ceremony. She thought she understood it. She thought it might be one of the things she understood best about him, which was a thought she turned over twice before setting it down somewhere she could retrieve it later. "Can I ask you something?" she said. They were 2 hours in. The soup was long finished. The bread had disappeared. The lanterns burned their steady blue. 3 rows of shelving stood between them and the door felt, at this hour, less like an exit and more like a theoretical concept. He looked up from the folder in his hands. "You're going to, regardless." "That's not—" She stopped. "That's probably fair." She set down her quill. "After the war, when the trials were happening, you didn't leave the country." He waited. "Most people expected you to," she said. "There was significant. I read some of the coverage. The expectation was that the Malfoys would relocate, that you specifically would. I know what the expectation was. Why didn't you?" The question sat between them in the blue light. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had learned to read, not as reluctance to answer, but as the process of locating the truest answer among several available ones. "Because leaving would have been easy," he said, "and I'd spent 6 years taking the easy thing." She held very still. "That's all?" she asked. "No." He set down his folder, leaned back slightly in his chair, in a posture she had never seen from him before. Something slightly open in it, the angle of a person who has decided to put something down rather than carry it through the conversation. "I stayed because running would have meant I decided it wasn't my country. And it is. Even the parts of it that spent 2 years trying to decide whether to put me in Azkaban." He paused. "It's mine. I'm not giving it away because it's complicated." The lanterns ticked. Somewhere in the archive's depths, the cataloguing charm continued its patient sorting. "I find that," she said carefully, "unexpectedly, I find that very—" "Don't," he said. His voice was not unkind. It was the same quality as when he'd answered both at the ministry junction, something that contained a full sentence in a single syllable. "I wasn't going to say anything patronizing," she said. "I know." He looked at her. "That's not why." She waited. "Because when you find something about me admirable," he said, "you get a particular expression, and it makes it harder to—" He stopped, redirected. "I'm more useful to you as someone you find difficult to categorize." The sentence arrived in the room and did not leave. She felt the specific quality of what it meant, not the surface of it, the deflection, the professional framing of useful. Underneath that, the acknowledgement that he had been tracking her expressions, that he knew what admiration looked like on her face, that he had noticed when it appeared, and underneath even that, the thing he hadn't finished saying. Makes it harder to— She did not ask him to finish it. She picked up her quill. "You're not difficult to categorize," she said, to the parchment in front of her. "You're just in a category I didn't have a name for before." The silence that followed had a texture unlike any previous silence between them. Not uncomfortable, something warmer than that, something that had weight without being heavy, the way certain kinds of music have weight. You feel it in the chest rather than the ears. "What would you call it?" he asked. She wrote a reference number in the margin, set the quill down again. "Honest," she said, "in a way that doesn't perform honesty. In a way that just is it, without expecting anything back." He said nothing. She looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen from him. Or perhaps she had. Perhaps it had been there before in fragments, in the almost amusement, in the quality of his attention at the committee meeting, in the archive 3 weeks ago when he'd noticed the mark the quill had left on her finger. Perhaps what she was seeing now was simply all those fragments at once, unmanaged, present without the careful distribution that usually kept them separate and individually deniable. She held it. She didn't look away, which she might have done, which she would have done 3 weeks ago, a reflex to protect herself from the directness of it. She held it, and something in her chest moved that was not nothing, that was in fact quite specifically something, and she acknowledged it to herself with the honesty she'd been practicing in small doses. "You notice him," she thought. "You have been noticing him for 6 weeks, and each week you notice more, and the noticing is not neutral, and you know it." "The section 3 folders," she said. "Did you finish the subsection on 1997? "A beat." "Almost," he said. They went back to work. At 10:30, Hermione made an error, a small one, a transcription mistake, a reference number copied incorrectly from a seized property ledger. She caught it 3 entries later, backtracked, found the source, corrected it with the particular suppressed irritation of someone who holds accuracy as a personal standard and experiences any deviation from it as a minor but real indignity. "You're allowed to make mistakes," Malfoy said without looking up. She stared at him. "I didn't say anything. You made a sound." She stopped. "What kind of sound?" He looked up then, the ghost of that almost smile. "The kind that means you've done something imperfect and you're deciding whether to be annoyed at the thing or at yourself." "I'm not annoyed at myself." "No?" He set down his quill fully, gave her his complete attention in the way that always carried a slightly uncomfortable amount of weight. "What are you doing then?" She opened her mouth, closed it. The honest answer was that she was annoyed at herself, at the error which was small and correctable and not the point. The point was the standard. The standard was not something she had been assigned from outside. She had built it herself, brick by brick, in the years after the war, after the year before that, after a childhood of being the person in the room who got things right, because getting things right was the only way she knew to be unassailable. She thought about what he'd said on the junction. Feel it in whatever situation it arrives. "I'm annoyed at myself," she said. He waited. "Which is disproportionate," she said. "I know it is." "You don't have to be perfect in here," he said. He said it quietly, without the framing of a lesson, without the tone of someone who's arrived at wisdom and is offering it down from a height. He said it the way you say a simple, factual thing to someone you believe capable of receiving it. "No one's watching." "I watch," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "That's the part that's exhausting, isn't it?" The archive held them both in its blue and patient light. The cataloguing charm ticked on. She thought about the day she'd received the committee memo, the cold tea she'd drunk without complaint, the 7:45 arrivals, the third hook from the left, the 1,200 small disciplines she'd built into the architecture of her days and inhabited so completely she'd stopped feeling them as choices and started feeling them as simply herself. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, not with satisfaction, not with the air of someone whose point has been proven. Simply an acknowledgement. I hear you. I have heard you for some time. She looked at him sitting across the archive table, the blue light picking out the pale planes of his face, the worn easy quality of his darker robes, the quill she'd borrowed and returned, and which now lived in his pocket as though it had always been there. And she felt something shift beneath the carefully engineered surface of her own interior. Not a fracture, not yet. Something subtler, the way frost shifts in the first days of a thaw, the molecular rearrangement that happens before anything visible changes. She reached for a new folder. Her hand passed through the small pool of lamplight between them, and for a moment her fingers were very close to his on the table. Not touching, not close enough to touch, but close in the way that close registers when you are paying the kind of attention to a person that turns proximity into information. He didn't move his hand, neither did she. They worked until midnight, when the archive's overnight enchantments dimmed the lanterns by half, and the cataloguing charm went silent, and the room became something so quiet that she could hear her own breathing, and, across the table, very faintly, his. She gathered her notes. He gathered his. They walked out together into the corridor, into the lift, into the vast empty lobby of the ministry at midnight. Marble floors that rang with every step, ceiling lost in the high dark, the fountain a murmur in the silence. The apparition point was across the lobby. Their footsteps echoed between them, not quite synchronized, close enough. At the point, they stopped. "Good work tonight," he said. It was the most ordinary thing he could have said. It was also, in its simplicity, its directness, its complete absence of subtext or qualification, exactly what she needed to hear from exactly him. "You too," she said. She disapparated. In her flat, standing in the dark of her kitchen, she found she was still holding the warmth of the archive around her, like something carried home without intending to. She stood with it for a moment, in the dark and the quiet, before she turned on the light. The invitation wasn't an invitation. It arrived as a memo, ministry standard, folded into the shape of a crane, the way all interdepartmental correspondence was folded, landing on her desk with its usual decisive authority. But the content was not usual. The content was 3 sentences, written in a hand she recognized now without needing to check the signature. "There's an exhibition at the Wizarding Cultural Archive on Friday evening. Primary collection covers wartime magical artifacts, relevant to the committee's documentation work, if you're interested. M." She read it twice. "If you're interested" was doing a considerable amount of work for 3 words. It was the grammatical equivalent of an open hand, not extended exactly, present, available for a response that could go in several directions without the sender having committed to any of them. She wrote back, "What time?" His response came in 4 minutes. 7. "I'll meet you there." She filed the memo in the left-hand drawer, underneath where his quill used to be, and returned to the document she'd been drafting. Her handwriting, she noticed, had the slightly more fluid quality it took on when she was not entirely focused on the act of writing. She did not comment on this to herself. Friday arrived with the particular quality of November Fridays, the week releasing its grip gradually, the city shifting into a different register as evening came, the streets outside the ministry acquiring that amber and dark palette of a place settling into its own company. Hermione left work at 6:15, which was 45 minutes earlier than her usual Friday, and she told herself this was because she needed time to change, which was true, and not because she had been finding concentration difficult since approximately 2 o'clock, which was also true. She wore grey, a fine wool dress, high-necked, belted, the kind of thing that was both entirely appropriate for a professional evening engagement, and also, she was aware, not what she would have chosen for a committee meeting. She noticed this distinction and let it stand without interrogating it further, which was itself a small act of the permission Draco Malfoy had been quietly extending to her for 6 weeks. The Wizarding Cultural Archive occupied a building in a narrow street off Diagon Alley that seemed, depending on your angle of approach, to be either 3 stories or 6. Its entrance was unassuming in the way that genuinely significant things often are. A dark wooden door, brass fittings worn to a soft gleam, a small sign that named the institution without advertising it. Inside, the building resolved its architectural ambiguity by simply being larger than its exterior suggested, which was a common enough enchantment, but one that always produced a moment of recalibration as you stepped through. He was at the entrance when she arrived, not waiting in any demonstrative sense. He was reading the collection notes posted beside the door, his hands in his pockets, his posture the characteristic settled vertical that she had come to think of as distinctly his. He turned when she came up the steps with the easy timing of someone who had peripheral attention to spare. He looked at her once, not a survey, not the slow appraisal of someone taking inventory, but a single glance that registered everything and produced, in his expression, a quality of very controlled stillness. "Granger," he said. "Malfoy," she said. They went inside. The exhibition occupied the archive's upper 2 floors, which were connected by a staircase of dark polished wood that curved in a way that made the ascent feel like entering something rather than simply climbing. The collection was arranged thematically rather than chronologically. The curatorial logic, Hermione noted, of someone who understood that events don't arrange themselves in neat sequence in the human experience of them, that the emotional geography of a period is not the same as its timeline. The first room contained objects that had been used for protection. Charms work, primarily, physical artifacts that carried the residue of defensive magic, displayed in cases with the careful lighting of things whose significance was not visible. A pair of ordinary-looking gloves that had been layered with 17 protective enchantments belonging to a Muggle-born family in Yorkshire. A child's toy, a small wooden rabbit, that had been so thoroughly charmed against detection that it no longer registered to any magical instrument, invisible to everything, its owner having poured everything they knew into making one thing in their world impossible to find. Hermione stood in front of the rabbit for a long time, Draco stood beside her, not commenting, not filling the space, simply present. "I did something like this," she said, "with my parents, before we left." She kept her eyes on the small wooden rabbit in its case. "I altered their memories, changed who they were, gave them new names, sent them away." She paused. "It worked. They were safe. I got them back afterward, and the modification reversed, and they were fine." Another pause. "I don't know if they're entirely fine. We don't discuss it." The room was quiet around them. A few other visitors moved through it at the peripheral distance that galleries encourage, each person enclosed in their own response to what they were looking at. "Why not?" he asked. "Because discussing it would mean—" She stopped, began again. "Because there are things I did during the war that I knew were right, and that I also knew that cost something. Something I can't give back. And living with that cost is easier if you don't take it out and look at it too often." She felt him turn slightly toward her, not enough to constitute a change in position, enough that the quality of his attention shifted from parallel to direct. "That's not easier," he said. "That's just slower." She looked at him then. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized. Not the diagnostic neutrality of the early weeks, not the controlled, almost amusement, not the unguarded moment in the archive. Something that had all of those in it, layered, and underneath them something older and quieter and considerably more serious. "I know," she said. He nodded once. They moved to the next room. The second room was harder. Dark objects, confiscated, decommissioned, stripped of their active capability, but not of their history. The cases here were sealed with additional enchantments, the lighting cooler, the descriptive placards more precise and considerably more disturbing. Each object had a provenance. Each provenance named the event it had been part of, the witch or wizard who had wielded it, the person or people on the receiving end of its use. Hermione moved through it with the systematic attention she had brought to the archive files, reading everything, processing methodically, keeping the information at the specific working distance that allowed comprehension without devastation. She had gotten through 3 cases when she stopped. The object in the 4th case was a wand. Dark wood, 11 inches, a hairline crack along the lower third where it had been snapped and magically mended. The mend visible as a faint seam, like a scar. The placard named it as having been used in the destruction of a Muggle-born family's home in Wiltshire in December 1997. She had catalogued that file. She knew that name. She had written it in her colour-coded notes in her careful handwriting, with the quill she'd borrowed and kept for 6 days. Her hand, at her side, found the edge of the display case and pressed against it. "Hermione!" It was the first time he had used her name. Not Granger, the habitual professional distance of that, the schoolyard origin of it, the way it had functioned as punctuation rather than address. Her name, her actual name, in his voice, which was low and entirely without the clinical detachment he usually used as load-bearing infrastructure. She turned to him. He was closer than she expected. Not dramatically close, nothing that the other visitors in the room would have registered, but close in the way that close becomes significant when you have been carefully maintaining a particular distance for 6 weeks, and both of you know it. "I'm fine," she said. "I know," he said. "Come here." It wasn't a command. It was quieter than a command, quieter than a request, something that functioned in the grammatical space before either of those, in the register of I am here and you can rather than you should. She stepped toward him, not into any kind of embrace, nothing so defined as that, nothing that could be named so specifically. Simply closer. Close enough that the wool of his robes was a warmth at the edge of her awareness, and she could see, in the cooler light of this room, the precise quality of his expression. The thing he was not performing, the thing that was simply there, which was concern, which was attention, which was something that had no single name, something that was the accumulation of 6 weeks of corridors and archive tables and cold soup and blue lantern light and a quill kept in a drawer for reasons she'd stopped pretending she didn't know. He raised his hand, slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided to do something they have been not doing for long enough that the decision required effort. His hand came up and his fingers, cool, dry, precise, touched the back of her hand where it still rested against the display case. Not a hold, a contact, the lightest possible pressure of one hand on another, lasting perhaps 4 seconds, perhaps 5. She didn't move. She was aware, in extraordinary detail, of the warmth that spread from that contact, disproportionate to its pressure, to its duration, to anything that could be physically explained. The warmth of being noticed by someone who had been paying attention for a long time. The warmth of not having to perform being fine for 4 seconds, 5, 6. He withdrew his hand. She straightened. They stood for a moment in the cooler light of the second room, with the dark objects in their careful cases around them, and the other visitors moving at their peripheral distances, and neither of them said anything. And the silence was the most articulate thing that had happened between them since the first morning she'd walked into the committee room and sat opposite him and decided, with entirely false conviction, that this would be uncomplicated. "Dinner," he said, not a question. She looked at him. "There's a place on Marilleone Lane," he said. "Proper food, no canteen soup, actual lighting." He paused. "If you're interested." She heard the echo of the memo, the open hand of those 3 words extended again, available for a response that could go in several directions. She chose one. "Yes," she said. The restaurant was small, warm, the kind of place that understood candlelight, not as atmosphere, but as argument, a case made, with flame and shadow, for the value of looking at the person across from you rather than the room around you. They were given a table in a corner that was either chance or the maitre d's intuition, and they sat across from each other in a configuration that was technically identical to their archive table, their committee seats, every surface they had occupied together over 6 weeks, but was not, in any practical sense, the same thing at all. She ordered wine. He ordered the same without looking at the list, which meant he either knew the wine or trusted her choice, and she found, lifting her glass, that she hoped it was the latter. They talked, not about the committee, not about the exhibition after the first few minutes, about other things. His work outside the ministry, which turned out to involve the restoration of wizarding properties damaged or abandoned during the war, a fact she received with the carefully managed composure of someone who has just had a significant piece of a puzzle place itself without being asked. About her parents, more than she'd said in the exhibition, the whole of it, The memory charm and the reversal and the careful conversations that happened afterward that managed to address everything except the thing at the center. He listened the way he did everything, with complete and unhurried attention, without rushing her toward a conclusion, without filling the moments when she paused with reassurances she hadn't asked for. "Do you think they forgave you?" he asked when she'd finished. She considered it honestly. "I think they decided to," she said. "I think there's a difference." He looked at her over the rim of his glass. In the candlelight, he looked different than he did in the ministry's particular luminescence. Warmer, the precision of his features softened by the unsteady light. Something in his eyes that she had been cataloguing for 6 weeks, and could now, in this light, in this place, name. He was not looking at her the way someone looks at a person they find interesting. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a person they have been trying very hard not to look at for a long time. She felt the knowledge of it move through her like a change in weather. The atmospheric shift before rain, the charge in the air before lightning, the moment when everything is the same and nothing is. She picked up her glass. Her hand was entirely steady. She was not, inside the careful architecture of her chest, entirely steady at all. She dreamed about the wand in the case. Not a nightmare, nothing so dramatic. Simply the object in its careful light, with the hairline scar of its mending running along the lower third. In the dream, she was looking at it through the glass, and someone was standing beside her. And she knew without looking that it was him. And the knowing had the quality of something inevitable rather than surprising. The way you know in dreams that the door behind you leads somewhere specific without having to open it. She woke at 5:30 to the pewter light of a winter Saturday and lay in the particular stillness of someone who has surfaced from sleep too early and too completely to go back under. The dinner had lasted 3 hours. She had not planned 3 hours. She had planned dinner, a bounded, reasonable thing with a clear beginning and a foreseeable end, a natural extension of a professional evening that would allow her to return home at a sensible hour with her interior arrangements intact. What had happened instead was conversation that moved the way water moves, not in a straight line, finding the path of least resistance, pooling in unexpected places. They had talked past 10 o'clock without either of them registering the passage of time until the restaurant began its subtle indication that it was approaching the end of its evening, the candles on the other tables being extinguished one by one in a gentle perimeter that eventually left only theirs. He had walked her to the apparition point. They had stood in the cold night air of Marilleone Lane, the city doing its late-night murmur around them, a distant siren, the percussion of heels on pavement from a street away, the specific smell of London after 11, which was exhaust and old stone, and something else, something that had no name but was distinctly itself. And she had been aware, with the heightened sensory precision that arrives at the end of a significant evening, of every detail. The condensation of her breath in the cold air, the particular quality of the streetlight on the pale geometry of his face, the 3 inches of November night between them. He had looked at her for a long moment. She had looked back. Neither of them had said the thing that was in the space between them. Not because it wasn't there. It was undeniably there. It had been accumulating for weeks with the patient inevitability of water finding a crack. But because the unsaid thing had a quality of completeness in its silence that speaking would have changed, not ruined, changed, altered into something more defined and therefore more breakable. She had said good night. He had said good night. She had disapparated. And now it was 5:30 on a Saturday morning, and she was lying in the grey light of her bedroom ceiling, thinking about 3 inches of November air and the specific way he had looked at her in the candlelight of a restaurant in Marilleone. And she was done, she understood, with pretending that this was something she could file away. She got up, made tea, stood at her kitchen window, watching the city come gradually to terms with the morning, the sky lightening by degrees, the street below acquiring its first Saturday pedestrians. A man walking a dog that moved with the philosophical slowness of an animal that had understood something important about the relationship between urgency and outcome. She drank her tea hot, all of it, without letting it go cold. She thought about what she knew. She knew that she had spent 6 weeks in the company of a person who had been, for most of her formative years, a source of active harm, and had found him to be not the absence of that person, not a different person, but the same person in whom something had burned down and been rebuilt from better materials. She knew that she found his intelligence compelling in a way that was distinct from the way she found other people's intelligence compelling. Sharper, more unsettling, more capable of finding the exact place in an argument where she was reasoning from evidence versus reasoning from preference. She knew that she had kept his quill in her drawer for 6 days. She knew what she felt in the restaurant when he had looked at her with that particular quality of attention. And she knew that she had felt it before, in smaller doses, in corridors and committee rooms and the blue-lit archive, and that she had been filing it under provisional categories and insufficient labels, because the accurate label was one she hadn't been ready to use. She was, she thought, looking out at the Saturday city with her empty mug in both hands, possibly ready now. His letter arrived at 9 o'clock. An owl, not ministry standard, his own. A severe-looking bird with the colouring of something that had decided early in life that it would not be performing warmth for anyone. It deposited the letter on her kitchen windowsill with an air of having discharged its professional obligations and expecting no gratitude for it. She opened the letter. I found myself thinking, on the way home, that I should have said something I didn't say. I've decided this was probably right. I also find I'm uncertain what the consequences of saying it would be, which is not a position I'm accustomed to. I'll be in the archive this afternoon if you want to continue the Section 4 cataloguing. That's not what I'm uncertain about saying. I'm aware of the distinction. D. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, more slowly, giving each sentence the attention it was asking for. She put down the letter, picked up her quill, her own quill, standard ministry nib, adequate but not excellent, nothing like the balanced precision of his. She wrote 4 words on a piece of parchment. What time this afternoon? She sent it with the severe owl, which accepted the return correspondence with the expression of an entity that had not signed up for back and forth and was making its feelings known. His response took 7 minutes. 2 o'clock. Bring your notes. She was there at 1:53. He arrived at 2 exactly. The archive at 2 on a Saturday had a different character again, not the after-hours stillness of their midnight session, but a quieter daytime quality. The building operating on its weekend register, fewer enchantments running, the sorting charm silent, the overhead lights at a lower intensity that made the lantern's blue glow the primary source of illumination even in the afternoon. He set his bag on the table across from her usual chair and looked at her with the expression of someone who has made a decision about something and is now in the process of discovering whether the decision was correct. She looked back at him with the expression of someone who has also made a decision and is also discovering the same thing. "Section 4, she said. "Section 4, he agreed. They worked for 40 minutes, the comfortable working silence that had developed between them over weeks, their individual sounds, quill and paper, and the soft movement of folders filling the room without crowding it. She had stopped finding this silence remarkable. That it had ceased to be remarkable was itself remarkable. "The letter," she said, without looking up from the document she was cataloguing. "Yes," he said. "You said you should have said something you didn't say." "Yes." She set down her quill, looked across the table at him. He had set down his too. Had set it down, she noticed, before she had raised the subject, as though he'd been waiting for her to reach it. "What was it?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. One of his considered pauses, but different from the usual variety. Not the selection of the truest answer from several available ones. Something with more exposure in it. The quality of a person stepping onto uncertain ground with the full knowledge that it is uncertain. "That I've been trying very hard," he said, "to remain useful to you, in a professional sense, in the sense that allows me to justify the amount of attention I pay to you without having to be honest about the reason for it." The lanterns breathed their steady blue. The archive held them in its patient quiet. "And the reason," she said carefully, "is not professional." "No," he said, "it isn't." She absorbed this. She gave it the space it required, not stalling, not retreating into the analytical distance she would have used 6 weeks ago. Simply receiving it with the full weight of what it meant. "Draco," she said. His name. Her voice, using it for the first time without the schoolyard formality of surnames, without the distance that Malfoy had always carried. Her own distance as much as his. He went very still when she said it. Not frozen, still in the way deep water is still, with everything moving underneath. "I've been doing the same thing," she said, "finding reasons, professional context, committee work, archival necessity." She held his gaze. "I kept your quill for 6 days. Something shifted in his face. Not the almost smile, deeper than that, less controlled, the thing that the almost smile had always been a carefully managed representative of. "I know," he said. "You know? I gave it to you and didn't ask for it back," he said. "That wasn't an accident." The sentence rearranged something in the room. She felt the rearrangement physically. The atmospheric pressure of the archive changing by some unmeasurable degree. The quality of the space between them altering the way it had altered in the restaurant, in the gallery, in a dozen small moments over 6 weeks when something had shifted and she had chosen to file it away rather than look at it directly. She was not filing it away now. She stood up from her chair, not toward him. Not yet. Nothing so resolved as yet. She walked to the end of the row, the narrow space between the last shelf and the archive wall, and she stood with her back to the shelving and looked at the ceiling with the particular attention of someone gathering something they haven't quite assembled yet. She heard him push back his chair. He came around the end of the table and stopped at the entrance to the narrow space. Not entering, not presuming, simply present at the boundary of it, visible in her peripheral vision as a stillness. "I'm not frightened of you," she said to the ceiling. "I want to be clear about that. That's not what this is." "I know what this is," he said, quietly. She lowered her gaze to him. He was standing at the end of the row with his hands at his sides, and his expression doing the thing it had done in the restaurant, carrying too much, compressed into too small a space, all the layers present at once without the careful distribution that usually kept them separate. She could see all of it. She let herself see all of it. "I have spent 2 years," she said, "being very certain about everything, about who I am and what I believe and how I process things. I've built a very complete version of myself, and I've lived inside it very thoroughly." He waited. "And you," she said, "have spent 6 weeks finding every single place where it doesn't fit properly. Not to be cruel, not for any—" She stopped. "You just kept noticing and telling me what you noticed. And it—" She searched for the word and found, at the bottom of all her considerable vocabulary, the only accurate one. "It undid me, slowly, completely, in a way I didn't see happening until it already had." He had crossed the distance between them while she spoke. Not all of it, not the whole narrow length of the archive row, but enough that when she finished, he was close. The same 3 inches of November air that had been between them on Marilleone Lane, reproduced here in the blue lantern light of sub-level Archive C, with the smell of old parchment and the mineral faint trace of old magic, and something else, something that was simply him, wool and cold air, and the faint scent of whatever he used that she had never been close enough before to place. She was close enough now. "Hermione," he said. Just that. Her name, in his voice, with every layer of the past 6 weeks in it. The corridor, the committee room, the archive, the restaurant, the midnight cataloguing session, and the quill kept for 6 days, and the hand on hers over a display case, and the letter that had arrived at 9 o'clock this morning, with an owl that expected no gratitude and had received none. All of it in 2 syllables. She looked at him. The space between them was an intake of breath. She closed the distance. Not with urgency. Nothing so graceless as that. Nothing that would have collapsed the weight of everything that had preceded it into mere impulse. She moved toward him the way the tide moves, with the slow, inevitable authority of something that has been building for a very long time and has finally, simply, run out of reasons not to arrive. His hand came up first, the same hand that had rested against hers over the display case, cool, dry, precise, and it found her jaw with a care so deliberate it was almost unbearable. His thumb rested at the edge of her cheekbone. His fingers curved against the line of her jaw. He held her face as though it was something he had been thinking about holding for considerably longer than 6 weeks, and intended, now that he was here, to pay attention. She put her hand over his. Not to stop him, to confirm. He kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything, unhurried, exact, nothing performed for any imagined audience. It was quiet, that first kiss. It had the character of something settling into place rather than something igniting, though the warmth of it moved through her with the slow completeness of heat finding its way into cold stone. His other hand found the small of her back, a light pressure, a question asked through touch rather than language. She answered by staying entirely, deliberately still, not from shock, not from hesitation, but from the conscious choice to be present in it without moving toward what came next, without cataloguing or analyzing or anticipating. Simply here, simply this. The archive around them, and the blue lantern light, and the smell of old parchment, and the warmth of his mouth, and the extraordinary, unfamiliar sensation of not managing a single thing. When they separated, it was by degrees. The kind of ending that doesn't fully end, that leaves a residue of itself in the air between two people, like the last note of something played in a stone room. He kept his hand at her jaw. She kept hers over it. They looked at each other in the particular way of people who have just done something irreversible and are discovering that irreversible, in this instance, feels less like a door closing and more like one opening onto a room they hadn't known was there. "Well," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not the almost smile, the actual one, unguarded, arriving without the careful management that had always preceded it. It changed his face entirely. She found she needed a moment to adjust to the change, the same way your eyes adjust when you step from dim light into something brighter. "Well," he agreed. They did not return to the cataloguing immediately. They stood in the narrow archive row for a time that Hermione did not measure and did not want to, with the particular quality of people inhabiting a moment that hasn't finished yet. His hand had moved from her jaw to her hand, which he held with the same deliberate attention. Not tightly, not with possession, but with the specific quality of someone who has chosen to hold something and is conscious of the choice. She found, standing there, that she had a question. Several, in fact. Her mind was not the kind that went quiet simply because the heart had done something significant. But the questions had a different quality than they usually did, softer around the edges, less urgently in need of answers. "The letter this morning," she said. "You said you were uncertain about the consequences of saying it." "Yes." "Are you still?" He considered her. In the blue light, with the actual smile still present in some residual way in the set of his mouth, he looked like a version of himself she was only beginning to have access to. The version that existed underneath the professional neutrality, underneath the calibrated honesty, underneath the 6 weeks of careful management that she now understood had been, on his side as much as hers, a sustained exercise in not arriving at exactly here. "No," he said, "not anymore." She absorbed this. She let it settle where it needed to settle. "I should tell you something," she said. He waited with the quality of someone who has decided that waiting for her is not a cost, but a practice, something he intends to keep doing. "I came to the archive at 1:53, she said. He looked at her for a moment. "I know. You know. The archive log. The enchantment stamps your entry time." A pause. "I checked when I arrived." She stared at him. "You?" She stopped. The laughter came from somewhere unexpected, rising through her with the slightly surprised quality of something that hadn't been used in a while, finding its mechanism still worked. It wasn't a polished sound, not the social laugh she produced at ministry functions. Something more unguarded, more genuinely delighted. He watched her laugh with an expression she had no existing category for. Something openly fond. Something that hadn't been put through any filter before it arrived on his face. "You checked the archive log," she said, when she could. "I wanted to know," he said simply. "Why?" "Because it mattered to me whether you came early." She looked at him. The laughter had settled into something warmer, something that lived lower in her chest, a quality of feeling she was going to need. She understood new vocabulary for. "It matters to you," she said slowly, "whether I come early to an archive." "Among other things," he said. They did eventually return to Section 4. Not immediately, and not with the same quality of focused professional attention they had brought to it before. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the room, not dramatically, not in any way that would have been legible to anyone else, but legible to both of them in the particular way that shared private knowledge makes a space feel different. The lanterns burned the same blue. The shelves held the same weight of documented history. The cataloguing charm was still silent. But there was a quality of warmth in the archive that had not been there before, and Hermione found, working through the Section 4 documents with her quill and her colour-coded system, and the accumulated methodology of 6 weeks, that she was not at her usual working distance from what she was reading. She was closer, not recklessly, not without the professional framework, which was real and necessary and served the actual people named in those files, but closer. Present with it in the way she'd been present with the kiss, not managing, not filing, not maintaining the exact temperature required for functional processing. She read a property record for a family in Lincolnshire and felt the weight of it without immediately converting the weight into action. She let it be heavy for a moment. Then she made her notation precisely and correctly and moved to the next file. Across the table, Draco was watching her. Not continuously. He was working, genuinely, with the focused reading that characterized his method. But between documents, in the brief margins of the work, his attention returned to her with the easy frequency of something that had stopped requiring deliberate direction. "You're doing it differently," he said. She looked up. "The cataloguing?" "The reading," he said. "You're letting it land." She considered this. "Yes," she said. "I think I am." He held her gaze for a moment with the expression she now had a name for. That openly fond quality, unfiltered, arriving without the careful distribution that had kept it invisible through 6 weeks of corridors and committee rooms. Then he returned to his document. She returned to hers. They worked until 4:30, when the archive's afternoon enchantments shifted the lanterns toward their early evening register, and the quality of the blue light deepened by a shade, and Hermione set down her quill and looked at the completed Section 4 catalogue with the specific satisfaction of something finished properly. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. They gathered their things. The comfortable geometry of it, her colour-coded notes into her folio, his rolled pages with their characteristic looser method, the paper bag from the soup folded flat beside her bag, because she had, apparently, brought soup again, not for the archive session precisely, but because his letter had said 2 o'clock, and she had thought about lentil soup at some point during her Saturday morning and acted on the thought without examining it. He had eaten his without comment when she'd produced it at 3 o'clock. He had also not mentioned that she'd brought it. She had loved him a little for both of those things. The word arrived in her own mind with the casual certainty of something that has been true for longer than it has been acknowledged. She didn't flinch from it. She let it sit where it had settled, in the part of her chest where the careful architecture had been loosening, brick by brick, for 6 weeks. Not yet. She wasn't going to say it yet. Not because she was afraid of it. She wasn't, she found, afraid of much of anything in this specific moment. But because it was true in the way that the most real things are true. Quietly, privately, without needing to be performed for anyone. She would know when it needed to be said. She was, for the first time in as long as she could remember, willing to wait for that moment, rather than anticipating and preparing for it. Outside the archive building, the city had moved into its late afternoon Saturday register. The narrow street held the specific quality of winter evenings before they fully commit. The light going amber at the edges of buildings, the cold sharpening, the sky above the rooftops a deepening blue that rhymed with the lanterns they just left. People moved through Diagon Alley's periphery with the comfortable purposefulness of a day winding toward its evening. They stood on the archive's front steps. "Dinner," she said, not a question. Her own version of the open hand he'd extended a week ago, the memo that had said, "If you're interested," extended now with the quiet confidence of someone who has stopped waiting to see what the gesture costs before deciding whether to make it. He looked at her, that actual smile again, the unguarded one she was already learning to read as the most accurate measure of anything he felt. "Dinner," he said. They went back to the restaurant on Marilleone Lane. The same corner table, definitely the maitre d's intuition this time, confirmed by the small recognizing nod as they entered, which Hermione filed with a private pleasure she made no attempt to suppress. The same candles, the same wine, not the same dinner. This one had none of the careful ambiguity of last week. The professional framing they'd brought as insurance, the way the conversation had moved toward intimacy gradually, by degrees, as though testing the temperature of the water before committing to it. They sat across from each other in the candlelight, and the conversation began where it actually was, not where it was safe to start. He talked about the restoration work, properly this time. Not the fact of it, which she'd known for a week, but the substance. A property in Devon that had been used during the occupation and left structurally damaged in ways that went beyond the physical, where the remediation charms had required not just technical skill, but a kind of patient negotiation with what a place held in its walls. He talked about it with a quality of attention that told her this work was not incidental to who he was. It was, she thought, the practical form of the thing he'd said on the ministry junction. "It's mine. I'm not giving it away because it's complicated." He was rebuilding the things that had been broken. Quietly, without announcement, with the focused care of someone who had decided that accountability was not a performance, but a practice. She told him about her parents again. Not the part she'd told in the gallery, the part after. The dinner she'd had with them in Oxford last spring, where everything had been careful and correct, and she had sat across from her mother and thought, "You don't know what I took from you," and had eaten her food and asked about the garden and smiled at all the right moments and driven home afterward and sat in her car outside her flat for 20 minutes before she could go inside. "I've never told anyone that," she said. He looked at her across the candles. "Why tell me?" The question was genuine, not deflecting, not false modesty. He wanted to know. "Because you'll understand it," she said, "without trying to fix it or reassure me out of it. You'll just know it happened and let it be a true thing." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes," he said, "I will." They stayed until the restaurant's perimeter of extinguished candles reduced them again to the last lit table. This time, when the final candle on the adjacent table went out, she looked at the small enclosed warmth of their own light and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, possibly had not felt in quite this form before. She felt, without qualification, without the managed distance, without any of the careful architecture she'd spent 2 years constructing between herself and the fact of her own interior. She felt entirely, precisely, where she wanted to be. Marylebone Lane, the cold night air, the same street, the same city sounds, the amber and dark of a Saturday evening. He stopped at the apparition point beside her. She turned to him. Last week they'd stood here and said goodnight, and everything that hadn't been said had filled the 3 inches between them with its unspoken weight. Tonight, the 3 inches held something different. Not absence, but presence. The full and acknowledged truth of what they were to each other, warm in the cold air. She looked up at him. He raised his hand and tucked a strand of hair away from her face. Not because it was in her way. It wasn't. It was simply a reason to touch her with that same deliberate care, the gesture that asked nothing and meant everything. She leaned up and kissed him. Not the careful archive kiss, quiet and settling. This one had more in it. The dinner and the candles and the Devon property and the 20 minutes outside her flat, and "I've never told anyone that," and 6 weeks of corridors and blue lantern light, and a quill kept in a drawer. This one was not a question. This one was an answer, full and unhesitating, offered with both hands. His arm came around her properly this time. She felt the warmth of it through her wool coat, the solid reality of him. The absolute, specific presence of this person who had spent 6 weeks finding every place her carefully constructed self didn't fit, and had never once suggested she ought to be different, only that she might, if she chose, allow herself to be more entirely what she already was. When they separated, she stayed close, her forehead almost at his shoulder, his hand in her hair. The city went about its Saturday business around them. "Draco," she said quietly, into the cold air between them. "Yes." She lifted her head and looked at him, at the pale, precise face in the amber streetlight, at the expression that was simply fully open in a way she suspected very few people had ever seen, and that she intended, from this point forward, to see as often as possible. "I don't know exactly what this is yet," she said. "I want to be honest about that." "I know," he said, "but I know that I want to find out." He looked at her for a long moment. The actual smile, unhurried and unguarded, arrived like something that had been waiting for exactly this. "Then we find out," he said. She took his hand. Not for an apparition. They stood perfectly still in the cold Marylebone night, in no particular hurry to go anywhere. His fingers closed around hers with the same deliberate attention he brought to everything, the careful consciousness of a person who had decided that what he held, he would hold properly. She thought about the memo that had arrived 3 weeks ago. Ministry grey, folded into a crane, landing on the precise centre of her desk and deciding her morning. The name that had been 6th on a list she had read twice. She thought about cold tea, and the third hook from the left, and the architecture of a life built for safety rather than living, and the slow, careful work of the past 6 weeks that had been. She understood now the work of dismantling not herself, but the performance of herself, the version built for endurance rather than the one capable of this, of standing in a cold street at 10:30 on a Saturday, holding the hand of someone who had spent 6 weeks paying attention to her in the most particular and devastating and necessary way she had ever been attended to. The wind moved through the lane. She tucked herself slightly closer to him, which she did without thinking, and which he accommodated without remark, which was, she thought, exactly how it should be. Not managed, not negotiated. Simply, 2 people finding the arrangement that was comfortable and inhabiting it without ceremony. The abyss she had been afraid of, it turned out, was not dark at all. It was simply the full depth of herself, the anger and the grief and the imperfection and the cold tea drunk without complaint and the 20 minutes in the car outside her flat. All of it, the complete and unedited version, capable of being known. She had been afraid of being known like this. She was not afraid now. Above them, the winter sky held its cold array of stars, visible in the gaps between the city's light, distant and unhurried, burning without any requirement to be witnessed, simply present in the particular way that the most permanent things are present, without effort, without performance, as a simple and continuing fact. She held his hand in the dark. He held hers. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.
This story is not really about Draco and Hermione, it is about a wall, the kind you build after something hard happens, the kind that looks like strange from the outside, the kind that feels like safety until someone stands close enough to that you remember what warm is. Hermione built her wall perfectly, every brick in the right place, every feeling filled away, every morning exactly the same, and Draco never tried to break it, he just kept showing up, quietly, honestly, paying attention in a way that cost him something too. That is the thing about people who have already been through their own darkness. They do not fear yours, they simply sit beside it and wait. This story is also about permission, permission to be angry, to make mistake, to feel something in a room full of old files and bad memories, to keep a quill in a drawer for 6 days and know exactly why. We spend so much time performing who we are for our jobs, for other people, sometimes for ourselves, and sometimes, if we are lucky, someone comes along who see the performance and is not interested in it, who waits patiently for the real thing. That it was Draco give here, not rescue, not answer, just presence, and honestly, and a very good quill. I hope this story gave you something too, even something small, Thank you for listening.